What would it feel like to have freedom stolen overnight, your name erased, and your life reduced to silence behind barbed wire? I am your guide on forgotten history tales. Come with me as we step inside Stalin's Gulag. I take you now to a place where silence is not peace, but punishment. The year is 1941, and winter has sharpened its teeth across Siberia. Before me stretches an endless wilderness, white and wind-scoured. The ground so hard it rings like iron beneath the boots of the guards. The cold presses into the skin like needles, a force as much alive as any warden. Here, on the edge of nowhere, rises the perimeter of one of Stalin's Gulag camps, a lattice of barbed wire, guard towers looming like skeletal trees, and the faint wail of a wind that sounds almost human. This is the threshold. Beyond it lies a world stripped of all familiar rhythms. No day and night, only labor and exhaustion. No justice, only orders. No hope, save in fragments of memory that prisoners dare to keep alive. The atmosphere hits me before the first step inside. It is not just the cold, it is the sensation of being erased. These men and women were not criminals in the sense we imagine. They were teachers, peasants, engineers, poets, mothers, soldiers, priests, anyone whom the state wished to silence. Arrest could come from a careless word, a jealous neighbor, or a quota to be filled. One day you had a name, the next you were simply Zek, the prisoner. I hear the iron gate grind open, its hinges shrieking into the void. I smell the bitter smoke of birch fires from the guardhouse, mingling with the stench of unwashed bodies packed too tightly in wooden barracks. The first thing taken from a prisoner is not their coat or their belongings, but the illusion that the outside world still exists. Inside the Gulag, the world contracts into wire, snow, and the rhythm of commands barked in Russian. Bystry, faster. When the journey here has already broken many, prisoners arrive after weeks crammed in cattle cars, their breath frosting the air, their bodies pressed together like cargo. Food was a crust of bread, water a handful of melted snow. The cars reeked of sweat, urine, despair. By the time the doors opened onto this frozen horizon, most were already ghosts of themselves. Those who stumbled from the wagons found themselves at the mercy of the Siberian wind, an executioner without bullets. I watch as new arrivals are marched toward the camp offices. The guards beat the snow from their coats with rifle butts. A prisoner staggers, too weak to stand. He is kicked aside, left to crawl. The paperwork is clinical, names rewritten into numbers, past lives erased with ink. I hear the scratch of pens, the hollow stamp of seals, sounds that feel heavier than the clatter of chains. Inside the barracks, the air is thick with human breath and wood smoke that fails to warm. Rows of wooden planks serve as bunks, 3 tiers high, packed so tightly that men must lie on their sides like sardines. The stove in the corner is fed too little wood. Its warmth dies before it reaches the far wall. Lice crawl freely. Prisoners whisper in the dark, voices trembling between prayer and memory. Some recite poetry under their breath, as though holding on to words is the last defense against becoming only flesh and bone. The food is handed out, watery cabbage soup, sometimes a sliver of fish, more often only gruel. Bread is the currency of life. I see men hiding crumbs under their rags, women tearing portions smaller than a fingertip to stretch a meal across days. Hunger is not an emptiness. It is an animal that claws from the inside, a constant gnawing that never ceases. But it is the labor that defines the Gulag. At dawn, long before the sky brightens, Prisoners are driven out through the gates in columns, tools slung across shoulders. Some march to logging camps, axes biting into frozen pine. Others stumble toward mines, picks striking rock until palms split and bleed. Temperatures plunge to 40, 50 degrees below zero. Breath crystallizes instantly, forming frost masks across faces. Sweat freezes inside coats, fingers blacken with frostbite. The guards watch from horseback or from towers, rifles glinting under the pale sun. Escape is almost impossible. Beyond the wire lies nothing but endless taiga and tundra, hundreds of miles of lethal emptiness. Prisoners know that to run is to die in the snow, and yet some still attempt it, driven not by hope of freedom, but by refusal to submit. Their bodies, when found, are displayed as warnings. As I walk among them in this vision, I feel more than the ache of muscles or the bite of wind. I feel the crushing weight of time. A sentence here could mean 10 years, 15, 20. Years measured not in calendars, but in trees felled, stones hauled, trenches dug. Time in the Gulag is elastic. Days blur, months vanish. The seasons cycle between blizzard and swarm of mosquitoes. Prisoners live moment to moment, measuring survival in breaths and bread. The Gulag was not merely punishment, it was a machine. It produced timber, coal, gold, canals, railroads. Stalin's industrialization was built on backs bent in these camps. To the state, these were not wasted lives. They were resources to be consumed. I hear the clank of chains, the crash of falling timber, the endless echo of shovels striking permafrost. The land itself seems to absorb the suffering, as though Siberia is feeding on human endurance. And yet, even here, flickers of humanity survive. I glimpse a man sharing half his bread ration with another on the verge of collapse. A woman hums a lullaby from her village, her voice thin but carrying warmth through the cold. Men carve tiny figurines from scraps of wood, tokens of memory and rebellion. These small acts are defiance, reminders that the state could not fully erase the soul. Still, the air is heavy with despair. I hear whispers of prisoners who talk to shadows, who wake screaming in the night, who sit staring into the snow until they no longer rise. Death is not dramatic here. It comes quietly, like sleep. A man collapses in the line, his body carried aside without ceremony. Another fails to wake in the morning, his place on the bunk quickly filled. Life and death blur until both seem equally unreal. And then comes the night. The guards lock the gates, the barracks groan with shifting bodies, and silence falls again. The same silence that greeted me at the threshold. It is not the silence of peace, but the silence of erased voices. Outside, the wind moans across the steppe, a reminder that nature itself conspires with the camp to keep prisoners trapped. I feel it now. The Gulag is not merely a prison of wood and wire. It is a prison of the mind, a place where time, hope, and self are dismantled brick by brick. And yet, this is only the beginning. For what waits beyond the daily struggle is a deeper story. The machinery of fear that placed millions into these camps, the ideology that justified it, and the terrible human toll hidden beneath statistics. I take you away from the frozen barracks and back into the world that fed them, the world of Stalin's Soviet Union, where fear itself was as common as bread. It begins not in the wilderness of Siberia, but in the crowded apartments of Moscow, in the villages scattered across Ukraine, in the factories of Leningrad. For the Gulag was not only a distant place of exile, it was the shadow that stretched across every household. It is night in Moscow, 1937. The city is hushed, but the silence is not restful. Families wait in dread for the sound of boots on the stairwell. The secret police, the NKVD, arrive at night because darkness magnifies terror. I hear the sudden knock, a heavy, deliberate pounding that echoes through narrow hallways like the drumbeat of fate. Children wake, mothers clutch them close. Fathers open the door with trembling hands. Inside the apartment, the atmosphere thickens. The smell of boiled potatoes from supper lingers in the air, mingling with the acrid scent of leather coats and cigarette smoke brought in by the officers. Papers are searched, drawers emptied, books leafed through with suspicion. The accusation is rarely explained. Sometimes it is espionage, sometimes sabotage, sometimes nothing more than a neighbor's denunciation. But the charge does not matter. What matters is the quota. Stalin's Great Terror was a machine, and every machine requires fuel. The fuel was human lives. Regional NKVD offices were given targets, a certain number of enemies to be arrested, interrogated, convicted. I see the officers flipping through lists, ticking names, ensuring their numbers are met. A teacher who quoted the wrong poet, a factory worker who complained of shortages, a farmer suspected of hiding grain, all become cogs in this process. It is not madness, though it looks like madness. It is systematic. The state convinces itself that enemies are everywhere, that vigilance must be total. And so the net is cast wide, dragging millions into its mesh. Stalin's signature is on the orders, but the machinery runs because countless others operate it. Clerks, interrogators, judges, guards. Terror is not only a command from above, it is also the silence of neighbors below. I step into the interrogation rooms, where men sit under naked light bulbs that burn all night. The air reeks of sweat, ink, and fear. An NKVD officer slams a file on the table. "Confess," he demands. The prisoner protests innocence, but the script has already been written. Sleep deprivation, threats against family, beatings. These are the tools that produce confessions. I hear the scratch of pens as prisoners sign papers condemning themselves to crimes they never committed. Psychologically, the effect is devastating. To confess is to betray the self, but to refuse is to invite endless torment. Many broke, and in breaking, they implicated others. One false confession birthed dozens of new arrests, like sparks spreading into a forest fire. The Gulag was not filled only by direct guilt. It was filled by chains of accusation that spread from friend to friend, colleague to colleague, until no one was untouched. The trial is brief. Often it is not even a trial, but a rubber stamp by a military tribunal. Sentences are pronounced in minutes. 10 years in the camps, 15, 25. The numbers roll off tongues with chilling ease, as though they were merely accounting figures. In the bureaucracy of terror, a life is reduced to a statistic, a file number, an entry in the vast archives of repression. I see wives waiting outside the courthouses, clutching scarves against the cold, hoping for news. They are told nothing. Some are arrested themselves for daring to ask. Children become enemies' offspring, stigmatized at school, shunned by neighbors. Terror does not end with the prisoner. It ripples outward into every circle of connection. And then comes the transport. Prisoners are herded into trains under guard. I hear the clang of the iron doors sealing shut, the desperate shouts muffled into silence. Inside, the air is suffocating. Men and women press shoulder to shoulder, some standing for days without rest. Buckets overflow, the stench unbearable. The guards provide little food or water. By the time the train screeches into the vastness of Siberia, dozens may already be dead. To survive the journey is only the first ordeal. For many, the shock of the camps, the cold, the labor, the hunger, is compounded by the suddenness of it all. One day they were free, the next they are Zek, cast into a world where the laws of humanity no longer apply. What fascinates me most is not only the brutality, but the psychology of survival. Imagine living in a world where a neighbor's glance might be your undoing, where loyalty to a friend could condemn you both. Trust evaporated. People learned to speak cautiously, to weigh every word. Silence became the safest language. I hear conversations filled with half-sentences, pauses, the careful avoidance of names. Stalin's world was a theater of masks. And yet there was resistance. Small, quiet, often invisible. A poet writes verses in his head, memorizing them line by line so they will not vanish even if he does. A mother hides a forbidden icon in her mattress, risking arrest for faith. A worker slips an extra potato to a hungry comrade, defying the system's demand for absolute obedience. These acts are not grand rebellions, but they are sparks of human dignity in a landscape designed to extinguish it. The reach of this machinery was vast. By the late 1930s, millions had passed through arrest, interrogation, trial, and transport. Some were executed outright, their bodies buried in mass graves. Others were swallowed by the Gulag archipelago, dispersed across the frozen wilderness of the Soviet Union. The camps stretched like a hidden empire, larger than many nations, invisible on maps but very real in the lives of those inside. And still, the arrests continued. At night, the knocking echoed, boots pounded stairwells, trains rumbled east. The machinery never stopped. It consumed artists, generals, peasants, priests, workers, lovers, children, until the very fabric of society was saturated with fear. I stand now in the middle of that machinery, and I feel the weight of it pressing on all sides. It is not only the physical brutality of the camps that defines the Gulag system, but the psychological universe that created them. It is a world where truth is meaningless, where fear is more powerful than law, and where survival depends not on innocence, but on invisibility. And yet, for all its power, the system had a flaw. For when millions are condemned, the camps themselves become unstable communities, places where human interaction, suffering, and endurance intertwine in unexpected ways. Inside the wire, prisoners created their own societies, hierarchies, and strategies to endure. I take you now past the frozen gates and into the living heart of the Gulag, the society that was forced to exist inside barbed wire. At first glance, it is chaos. Men and women from every corner of the Soviet Union crammed together in wooden barracks. Peasants, intellectuals, thieves, priests, soldiers, all stripped of identity, all reduced to Zek. And yet, within this crucible, an order emerged, as strange and brutal as the world outside. When the day begins before dawn, a whistle shrieks through the icy air, followed by shouts, "Podyam! Up!" Prisoners stumble from bunks, their bodies stiff from cold. The barrack reeks of sweat, mold, and the sour stench of lice-infested rags. In the corner, the iron stove has long gone cold. Its thin warmth never reached the far walls. I see men slapping themselves awake, shaking frost from their blankets, scrambling to gulp down a thin bowl of cabbage water before the work columns form outside. The hierarchy is clear the moment they step into the yard. Guards bark orders, rifles slung casually, dogs straining on leashes. But it is not only the guards who hold power. Among the prisoners themselves, there is another order, one created by necessity and violence. At the top are the blatni, the professional criminals. Tattooed, hardened, speaking in coded slang, they rule the barracks like kings. They steal food rations, enforce their own laws, and wield knives fashioned from scrap metal. For the political prisoners, teachers, engineers, poets, these criminals are often more terrifying than the guards. I see a young man clutching his bread ration, only to have it snatched away by a thief with a grin carved across his face. Resistance means a beating. Silence means survival. And yet, alliances form. Some politicals learn to bargain with the criminals, trading skills, writing letters, repairing boots, for scraps of protection. Others simply endure, hoping to remain unnoticed. The criminals may despise the politicals, calling them enemies, but the truth is that all are trapped in the same machine. Work battalions leave the camp in columns. They march into forests, mines, and frozen quarries. The rhythm is mechanical. Boots crunching on snow, tools clattering against iron wagons, guards barking from horseback. Here, society fractures further. Stronger prisoners are assigned to heavy labor, while the weak are sent to lighter tasks, or to none at all, left to die. A man's fate often depends not on skill, but on his body's endurance. Yet even in this brutal order, humanity flickers. I see prisoners sharing bread crusts, steadying each other when one stumbles, whispering encouragement on the march. Small gestures mean survival. A spoon passed quietly to a comrade can mean the difference between life and death. In the bleakest landscapes, solidarity becomes a hidden treasure. At night, the barracks transform into a theater of voices. Prisoners whisper stories, poems, prayers. Some recite Pushkin or Lermontov from memory, their words drifting like fragile warmth through the icy air. Others carve chess pieces from wood, play games by candlelight, inventing order where none exists. There are arguments about politics, about God, about survival itself. Some believe the state will one day recognize its mistake. Others know better, that they are not mistakes, but sacrifices to a system that thrives on fear. The informers move silently among them. These are prisoners who report to the guards, sometimes out of fear, sometimes for extra bread. They sit quietly, listening, memorizing names and words. A single sentence spoken in confidence might return as an accusation the next day. Trust is a currency rarer than gold. The women's camps tell another story, one of both cruelty and resilience. Women are forced into the same labor, logging, hauling, mining. They endure not only hunger and cold, but harassment and violence from guards and criminals alike. And yet I see them weaving small miracles. A woman stitches scraps of cloth into a doll for her child. Another hums a lullaby, her voice trembling but steady. Women often became the keepers of memory, reminding others of home, of life beyond the wire. Love, too, existed here against all odds. Couples formed in secret, risking punishment for the brief comfort of closeness. Letters smuggled between camps carried words more precious than food. In a world built to erase humanity, the act of loving was rebellion. Death was constant. It came from exhaustion, from hunger, from frostbite. The weak were carried from work brigades and dumped into shallow graves. There was no ceremony, only snow covering the earth once more. Yet even death created its own rituals. Prisoners would whisper the name of the fallen, refusing to let it vanish into silence. Some carved crude crosses, others left small tokens, a button, a piece of wood, as proof that the dead were once alive. The society of the Gulag was not merely about survival. It was also about meaning, prisoners searched for reasons to endure. Some found it in faith, clutching hidden icons or crossing themselves in secret. Others found it in words, composing poems and songs that lived only in memory. Still others found meaning in sheer defiance, the refusal to surrender the last fragments of self. I feel the weight of this strange world pressing in from all sides. It is a society where strength and cruelty often win, but where kindness, though fragile, shines all the brighter. It is a place where human beings are reduced to tools, yet still carve out spaces of dignity. The Gulag was not only a prison system, it was a mirror of the Soviet Union itself, a distorted reflection where fear ruled, but humanity refused to die. The barracks quiet now. Prisoners lie on their bunks, staring into the dark, their bodies twitching with hunger. Outside, the guards circle with lanterns, their dogs barking into the void. Snow drifts against the walls, sealing them into another night. And still, in the silence, I hear a prisoner whisper a line of poetry. Even in chains, the soul remembers it is free. I take you now from the barracks into the vast work sites that defined the Gulag. For this was not simply a prison, it was an empire of labor, a machine that consumed millions of lives and spat out canals, railways, mines, and forests stripped bare. Stalin's vision of industrialization was not powered by factories alone, but by the bodies of prisoners scattered across the frozen wilderness. The work begins before sunrise. Prisoners march in lines, snow crunching under boots, tools slung across weary shoulders. The guards ride ahead on horseback, rifles hanging lazily but ready. Their dogs bark against the wind. Breath freezes instantly, white clouds rising like smoke from the columns. A whistle shrieks, and the day begins. One of the most infamous projects was the White Sea-Baltic Canal, carved by hand through frozen swamps and forests in the early 1930s. I see the line of prisoners hacking at earth with picks, their bodies bent, shovels clanging against rock. The canal stretches for hundreds of miles, a scar carved across the land by human desperation. They work with primitive tools, no machinery, only sweat, blood, and frostbitten fingers. In the silence, I hear the dull thud of spades, the groans of men collapsing into mud. The cost is staggering. Thousands die, their bodies buried in the embankments, the canal itself becoming their tomb. And yet, the project is celebrated in Moscow as a triumph of Soviet will, a monument to progress. Stalin's empire is built not only on the labor of prisoners, but on the silence of those who never see the graves. Mining camps tell a darker story still. In Kolyma, far in the northeast, the land hides veins of gold. Stalin's regime craves it, for gold funds the machinery of state. But to extract it, men must dig into frozen earth harder than steel. I hear the pickaxes striking permafrost, the metallic ring echoing through icy valleys. Prisoners descend into shafts with no safety, no light beyond flickering lamps. The air reeks of sweat and damp earth, lungs clog with dust. Frost creeps even underground. At 40 below, tools freeze to skin. Men work until their fingers blacken, until exhaustion drags them down. Those who falter are beaten, sometimes shot, and yet the gold flows outward, carried on sledges and barges, feeding Moscow's coffers. The price is counted not in rubles, but in bones. Forests fall next. Logging camps stretch across Siberia like scars. Prisoners wield axes as tall as themselves, chopping pine and birch, the thunder of falling trees rolling across valleys. Each trunk must be dragged by hand, loaded onto sleds, hauled for miles. The snow is red with burst blisters, with blood from frost-bitten wounds. The guards demand quotas, so many cubic meters of timber per day, quotas that no starving man can meet. Fail, and punishment follows. Reduced rations, solitary confinement in unheated cells, sometimes death. Hunger becomes the whip. The system ensures that survival is tied to labor. Work harder, eat slightly more. Work less, starve. The stomach becomes the overseer, and the body devours itself to keep pace. The Gulag is not random chaos. It is carefully calibrated exploitation. Every stroke of an axe, every shovel of dirt, every log dragged through snow is measured, recorded, turned into statistics. The Soviet state prides itself on numbers. I see clerks in heated offices tallying production, drawing neat lines on graphs, while outside, men collapse in ditches. For Moscow, the Gulag is an engine of progress. For the prisoners, it is a graveyard disguised as work. But the empire of labor is not only about production, it is about punishment through exhaustion. Stalin understood that to break a man's spirit, you must break his body. Endless work, endless quotas, endless cold. It was not enough to imprison people. They had to be ground down into dust. Their lives poured into projects that served the state, but erased the individual. And yet, within this landscape of suffering, I see flashes of strange resilience. A prisoner pauses during logging to carve a small cross from pine scrap. Another, in the depths of a mine, scratches his name onto a stone wall, proof that he once existed. These marks, invisible to the outside world, are acts of defiance. They declare, I was here. I endured. Some even found pride in labor, not for the state, but for themselves. A bridge built with skill, a tool repaired with ingenuity, a song hummed in rhythm with the swing of axes. These were not victories the state intended, but they were victories nonetheless, tiny sparks against the great dark. The camps themselves become monuments to contradiction. The White Sea Canal is completed, but it is too shallow for most ships. A hollow achievement bought with thousands of lives. Railroads stretch across frozen tundra, but many collapse within years. Timber is harvested in staggering numbers, but much rots unused. The machine of labor consumes endlessly, but it wastes as much as it builds. Efficiency was never the goal. Control was. What mattered was that the prisoners labored, that their bodies were spent in service of the state. The Gulag was both factory and punishment, production line and grave. Stalin's empire did not merely want progress. It wanted obedience, demonstrated through toil. I stand now at the edge of a quarry, the wind shrieking through the pits. Below me, hundreds of prisoners swing pickaxes, their forms like shadows against the snow. The guards' rifles glint on the ridge. Beyond them, endless white stretches into silence. The prisoners are invisible to the world, but here, in the heart of Siberia, they are the foundation of an empire. And I realize something chilling. The Gulag was not only about removing enemies, it was about harnessing them, grinding their lives into stone, gold, and timber, then erasing their memory. It was progress carved by suffering, monuments built from bones. I take you deeper now, not into the snow or the mines, but into the minds of those who endured. For in the Gulag, survival was never only a matter of bread or strength. It was a battle of the spirit, a war fought silently inside the skull and the heart. Those who lost hope died quickly. Those who clung to some fragment of meaning, however fragile, sometimes endured. The first lesson of survival was adaptation. I see a man arriving from Moscow, his coat still bearing the scent of city smoke. He stumbles at first, coughing from cold, bewildered by hunger. But slowly, he learns the code. Do not speak too freely. Do not trust too easily. Hide bread under your clothes. Hold your spoon tightly. He bends his body to labor, paces himself to avoid collapse. In his eyes, I see a decision. If the state has condemned me, I will not let it break me. For others, survival began with ritual. Prisoners carved tiny routines into the chaos of camp life. One recites a prayer every morning before roll call. Another combs his hair carefully, even with broken fingers, as though to remind himself he is still human. A poet whispers verses in the dark, shaping words that exist only in memory. These rituals are fragile fortresses, small acts that defy the state's attempt to erase individuality. Hunger is the great enemy. It gnaws constantly, a beast that lives inside the stomach. I hear men dreaming aloud of food: black bread, warm potatoes, salted herring. Some obsess over recipes, reciting them as though each word might summon flavor. Psychologists later called this the food dream. It was dangerous and comforting at once. Dangerous because it drove men mad with longing. Comforting because it tethered them to life outside. To endure hunger, prisoners developed strategies. Some learned to eat slowly, savoring each crumb. Others hoarded, tucking away morsels to stretch into the night. But the cruelest law of the Gulag was this: to work more meant to eat more. Extra rations were given only to those who met impossible quotas. And so the body devoured itself in the effort to earn the bread that kept it alive. Isolation was another enemy. The Gulag was crowded, yet loneliness thrived. Prisoners were cut off from families, from the warmth of ordinary life. Letters were censored, visits rare. Some lost themselves in despair, eyes hollow, movements mechanical. But others found strength in bonds forged inside the wire. I see two men sharing a bunk, whispering stories of their villages. A woman teaching another to stitch from scraps of cloth. Friendships, fragile and dangerous, became lifelines. To share bread, to guard a comrade's secret, to offer a word of encouragement. These acts wove invisible threads of community. They reminded prisoners that they were more than tools, more than statistics. But trust was always shadowed by betrayal. Informers lurked in every barrack, their ears hungry for words that could buy them favor. The knowledge that a friend might be listening for the NKVD corroded the soul, and so prisoners became cautious, measuring each sentence, weighing silence more heavily than speech. In this world, even friendship was an act of courage. The mind sought escape, and imagination became a weapon. I see a prisoner lying on his bunk, staring into darkness, but inside his head, he walks streets of his hometown. He imagines the smell of bread from a bakery, the sound of bells from a church tower, the laughter of children. Others built entire novels in memory, repeating lines until they lived like carved stone inside the brain. Faith, too, was a shield. Some turned to God, whispering prayers into the frost. Icons were hidden, crosses carved from scraps of wood. Others placed faith in politics, believing that the party would one day realize its error. And some placed faith in sheer defiance. I will not die here. I will not give them that victory. Yet not all could endure. I see men who stopped rising from bunks, who stared into space until their bodies withered. Psychologists of survival later called this camp apathy. Once it set in, death followed swiftly. The line between survival and surrender was thin, often invisible. A single moment, A choice to keep walking, to share a crumb, to recite a poem, could tip the scale between life and death. What fascinates me is how prisoners created meaning in a place designed to erase it. A teacher gave lessons in secret, scribbling numbers in dirt. A singer performed softly in the barracks, her voice trembling but steady. A craftsman carved chess pieces, giving prisoners a game to play. These acts were small, but they reminded people that the Gulag was not the whole universe, that beyond the barbed wire, life still existed. And survival was also political. To endure was to deny the system complete victory. I hear a prisoner say, "They can take my years, but not my soul." That defiance, whispered in the dark, was as powerful as any uprising. It was rebellion through persistence, a refusal to vanish into silence. And yet, there were moments of open resistance. Strikes erupted in some camps, protests against impossible quotas or brutal treatment. These were dangerous, often ending in gunfire, but they showed that even under crushing oppression, the human will to resist could not be extinguished. I feel the tension now, the balance between despair and hope, between surrender and defiance. The Gulag was not only a place of suffering, but a laboratory of the human spirit. It showed the depths to which people could be broken, but also the astonishing strength they could summon to endure. A man recites a line of poetry as the night wind howls through the cracks in the barracks. Man is stronger than stone and stronger than iron. He endures. And in that whisper, I hear the secret of survival. I take you now to the moment most prisoners dreamed of, and yet feared as much as they longed for it, the day of release. Imagine a man who has endured 10, 15, even 20 years behind the wire. He has survived hunger, frost, labor, and despair. He has whispered poetry into the dark and clung to fragments of hope. And then, one morning, his name is called. Papers are stamped. The gates creak open. Freedom at last. But freedom is never simple. The first sensation is disorientation. A man who has marched in columns for decades, who has eaten when commanded and slept when ordered, now stands in silence. The barbed wire is behind him. The taiga stretches out before him. He is free. But where does he go? His village is thousands of miles away. The clothes on his back are rags. He carries no money, no food, only a slip of paper declaring him released. I see him walking along a frozen road, snow crunching beneath his boots. The world beyond the Gulag feels unfamiliar, even hostile. The villages he passes look at him with suspicion. He bears the mark of the Zek, hollow cheeks, worn clothes, the silence of one who has seen too much. To many Soviets, former prisoners were still enemies. Suspicion clung to them like frost. For some, return meant reunion. A wife waiting faithfully, children grown but eager. The smell of warm bread in a kitchen long missed, the embrace of family, and yet, even in joy there was strangeness. Fathers met sons they barely knew. Husbands returned to wives who had learned to survive alone. The years lost could never be restored. Conversations stumbled between memory and absence. Others found no reunion at all. Families had moved, remarried, or perished in the war. Letters had gone unanswered. Graves stood where homes had once been. For these men and women, release was not a return, but another exile, a freedom without anchor. I see one woman standing before a ruined cottage, the roof collapsed, the fields empty. She drops her bag in the snow, her shoulders sinking under the weight of silence. The scars of the Gulag ran deeper than absence. The body carried its marks, frostbitten fingers, weakened lungs from mines, crooked spines from endless hauling. The face was hollowed, the eyes sunken. Hunger left bones brittle, muscles thin. A man of 40 could look 70, and beneath the skin, the mind carried wounds less visible but more enduring. Nightmares stalked the released. The sound of dogs barking could send them trembling. The whistle of a train could summon memories of the cattle cars. Some woke in the night, expecting guards to shout, "Podyom!" Others hoarded bread under pillows, unable to believe food would last. Freedom did not erase the camp. It followed them like a shadow. And the state itself ensured the shadow never lifted. Release was rarely full absolution. Many were sent not back to their homes, but to internal exile, forbidden from living in Moscow, Leningrad, or other major cities. They were relocated to remote towns, watched carefully by local authorities. The stamp on their passport marked them forever. Former prisoner. Jobs were scarce, housing meager. Employers hesitated to trust. Neighbors whispered. Even when Stalin died, in 1953, and the first great amnesties came, suspicion remained. Men returned in floods from the camps, but society was not ready to welcome them. Some were branded criminals, others silenced from speaking of their suffering. To speak too openly was dangerous. Silence followed them, even in freedom. Yet some did speak. Writers like Alexander Solzhenitsyn transformed memory into testimony. His words carried the Gulag from the silence of the camps into the conscience of the world. Survivors wrote memoirs, whispered stories to their children, preserved fragments of truth against the state's attempts to erase it. These voices were fragile at first, but they grew until the Gulag could no longer be hidden in the shadows. But for the ordinary man or woman who left the wire, survival was quieter. It meant learning to live again in the rhythm of ordinary life, buying bread at a market without fear, sleeping without guards overhead, listening to music, touching earth without shackles, feeling warmth without ration. These small moments became miracles, and yet each miracle was haunted by memory. I see an old man sitting on a bench in a provincial town, his hands trembling as he peels an apple. To any passerby, he looks ordinary, but in his eyes flickers the memory of barracks, of hunger, of endless forests. He eats slowly, savoring each bite as though it is the first real food he has ever tasted. This is the paradox of release. The ordinary becomes extraordinary, but the extraordinary of suffering never fades. Some tried to bury the past. They refused to speak of the camps, even to their families. The pain was too deep, the shame too heavy. For in the logic of the Soviet state, even release did not erase guilt. To admit one's time in the Gulag was to invite suspicion. Silence became survival once more. Generations grew up never knowing the full truth of their parents' years behind the wire. And yet, for all its weight, release carried a fragile triumph. To walk free after years of forced labor was to prove that the state had not fully succeeded. To breathe, to see the sky without barbed wire, to hold a child's hand, these acts became declarations of survival. The Gulag could take years, health, and memory, but it could not claim the final word as long as the survivor still drew breath. Still, the scars endured. They were etched into faces, into gestures, into silences that lingered at kitchen tables. The Gulag was not left behind in Siberia. It lived on in the lives of those who carried it back into society. I take you now beyond the camps themselves, into the vastness of the Soviet Union that surrounded them. For the Gulag was not only a chain of prisons hidden in Siberia, it was a shadow cast across an entire society. It shaped how people spoke, how they trusted, how they remembered. It seeped into literature, into silence, into the very psychology of a nation. The first shadow was fear. Even those who never saw the inside of a camp lived under its weight. In Moscow, a man walking home at night might freeze at the sound of a car stopping behind him. In Leningrad, a family whispered at dinner, careful that walls might carry their words. In villages, neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. The Gulag existed not only to punish, but to remind. The state was watching, and no one was safe. This fear reshaped daily life. People avoided speaking openly about politics. Letters were written cautiously, their lines flat and lifeless, stripped of emotion lest they be misread. Children were taught never to repeat at school what was said at home. A joke could destroy a family. A sigh in the wrong company could mean a decade behind barbed wire. The Gulag became a silent presence in every conversation, a ghost that sat at every table. The second shadow was silence. Released prisoners returned home with their stories locked inside them. To speak too freely risked renewed suspicion. The state discouraged remembrance, erasing records, censoring voices, and so survivors often carried their memories alone, unspoken, unshared. Imagine a kitchen in the 1960s. A family gathers around the table, laughter over tea and bread. Yet the father sits quietly, eyes distant. He has spent years in Kolyma, years that his children barely know. They ask him once about the camp. He shakes his head, mutters, "Best forgotten." But nothing is forgotten. The silence becomes another prison, stretching across generations. And yet, memory resisted. Writers like Varlam Shalamov smuggled truth into literature. In his Kolyma tales, he described the cruelty and futility of the camps with stark precision. Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago transformed testimony into indictment, exposing to the world the hidden empire of repression. Their words cracked the silence, forcing a reckoning that the state had long tried to suppress. But even literature carried risk. Manuscripts were hidden under floorboards, typed secretly at night, passed hand to hand in samizdat. Illegal self-publication. To read such words was to defy the state. And yet, the hunger for truth was so strong that people risked everything for it. The Gulag also left a mark on culture through absence. Millions of voices, poets, scientists, musicians, were silenced. Some perished in mines, some vanished in execution pits, some returned but never spoke again. Imagine the symphonies unwritten, the discoveries unmade, the stories untold. The Gulag was not only a crime of suffering, it was a theft of possibility, a wound carved into the future of a nation. Even for those untouched directly, the Gulag shaped psychology. Citizens learned to navigate life through doublethink, to say one thing in public, another in private, to wear loyalty on the surface while hiding thoughts beneath. This dual existence corroded trust. Friendships were cautious. Love carried fear. Entire communities learned to live in masks, a performance that endured long after Stalin's death. The fear bred cynicism too. If the state could condemn anyone, then innocence was meaningless. If a poet could vanish for a line of verse, then words themselves were dangerous. People grew wary, skeptical, guarded. The Gulag turned society inward, teaching survival through silence and suspicion. But memory has a way of resurfacing. After Stalin's death, Khrushchev's secret speech denounced the purges, acknowledging the crimes. Amnesties freed many, archives began to open, survivors began to whisper more openly. Yet the shadow lingered. For even when the camps were dismantled, The trauma lived on in families, in habits, in silences passed from parent to child. I see a woman in the 1970s telling her grandson, "Do not speak too loudly. Do not trust too easily." She does not mention the Gulag, but the lesson is born from it. The camps ended, but the habits of fear did not. They seeped into the marrow of society. And what of the land itself? Across Siberia lie abandoned barracks, collapsed watchtowers, rusting barbed wire half buried in snow. Villages grew near camps, dependent on their labor, their memory entwined with suffering. Even today, bones are found in forests, shallow graves disturbed by thawing earth. The landscape remembers what the state tried to forget. The Gulag became a geography of ghosts. Each camp was a small world of suffering, but together they formed an archipelago stretching across a continent. To map the Soviet Union was to map these islands of pain, linked by trains, guarded by silence. And though the state erased them from official charts, they lived in memory, in whispers, in literature that refused to die. For the world beyond the Iron Curtain, the Gulag became a symbol of totalitarianism, a warning of what happens when fear governs. But for those who lived within, it was not symbol but daily reality. The Gulag shaped marriages, families, neighborhoods, friendships. It was not only a prison system, it was a social system, one that warped the very fabric of Soviet life. I stand now in a Moscow street decades after Stalin's death. The cars roll by, the shops glow with light, the city hums with ordinary life. But beneath the hum lies silence. How many of these families carry a hidden story? How many grandparents whispered verses in the dark? How many children grew up never knowing why their father never returned? The Gulag is absent from the street, yet present in the air, and I realize the shadow is not only historical, it is generational. The Gulag shaped not only those who endured it, but those who lived in its aftermath, those who inherited its silence, those who grew cautious because their parents had learned caution. The shadow does not lift quickly. It lingers, long after the gates are rusted and the watchtowers have collapsed. I take you now to the final chapter of this journey, not to a camp, nor a mine, nor a frozen barrack, but to the realm of memory. For the Gulag, though dismantled, has never truly ended. It lingers in bones unearthed from shallow graves, in silences carried across generations, in the uneasy conscience of a nation. The question is not only what happened inside the barbed wire, but how we choose to remember it and what lessons it leaves for us today. In Russia today, fragments of the Gulag still rise from the landscape. I see collapsing watchtowers, barbed wire rusting in the snow, barracks leaning like forgotten skeletons of wood. The wind moves through them like a voice, carrying whispers of those who once shivered inside. Bones still surface in forests and riverbanks, uncovered by thawing earth. Villages that once depended on camp labor live with half-remembered stories, where old men murmur of columns of prisoners, of gunshots in the night. For decades, the Soviet state tried to bury this past. Archives were sealed, survivors silenced, monuments rare. The Gulag existed in whispers, in hidden manuscripts, in the lines of poems passed in secret. But memory is stubborn. It waits. And when silence loosens, memory returns. I walk now into a museum in Moscow, the Memorial Society's small but powerful exhibit. Photographs of prisoners stare back at me, faces gaunt, eyes hollow, yet unbroken. Artifacts lie behind glass, a spoon carved from scrap, a notebook hidden for years, a child's drawing smuggled from exile. Each object is more than evidence. It is testimony, a whisper across time. We lived, we suffered, remember us. Outside, I see a monument, a great stone taken from the Solovki Islands, one of the first campsites. It stands in Moscow's Lubyanka Square, in front of the old NKVD headquarters. People lay flowers there each year, reading the names of the dead, name after name, hour after hour, for the list is endless. In the repetition of those names, I hear a kind of defiance. The state once reduced them to numbers, but memory restores them to humanity. Yet remembrance is fragile. In recent years, the politics of memory has grown contested. Some wish to forget, to bury the past beneath pride in Soviet achievement. Others fight to preserve the truth, to speak openly of the millions who passed through the camps. Memory itself has become a battleground, as though the Gulag's shadow still stretches into the present. Why does this matter? Because forgetting is dangerous. The Gulag was not an accident of history. It was the result of fear, paranoia, and the belief that human beings could be reduced to tools of the state. If we forget that lesson, we risk repeating it. The legacy of the Gulag is not only Russian. Across the world, its memory speaks to the dangers of unchecked power. It warns us of what happens when law becomes a weapon, when fear becomes governance, when ideology demands obedience at the price of humanity. It teaches us that silence is not safety, but complicity. I think of the survivors who told their stories, Solzhenitsyn, Shalamov, Ginsburg. Their words were not only about the Soviet Union, they were about all of us, about the fragility of freedom, the resilience of the human spirit, and the eternal danger of forgetting. To read them is to step inside the camps, to feel the frost and hunger, to hear the whispers of defiance, and in doing so, to carry forward the memory that the state once tried to erase. The Gulag also leaves us with a paradox. It was designed to destroy humanity, yet it revealed humanity's resilience. In hunger, men shared crumbs. In silence, poets recited verses. In despair, people dreamed of freedom. Even in chains, the soul refused to be erased. That, too, is legacy. The Gulag showed not only the cruelty of power, but the endurance of spirit. I stand now at a memorial site in Siberia. Snow drifts across a mass grave, a simple wooden cross marking the earth. The silence here is profound. No guards, no dogs, no shouting, only the wind. And yet, the silence is not empty. It is filled with memory, with the voices of those who once labored, who once whispered poetry in the night, who once looked at the stars through barbed wire and remembered that they were human. What does it mean to remember the Gulag today? It means to keep telling the stories, to speak the names, to visit the ruins and listen to the silence, to teach children not only the triumphs of history, but its shadows. Memory is not comfortable, but it is necessary. It is the shield against repetition, the thread that binds us to truth. For in the end, the Gulag was not only about camps, nor about Stalin, nor about statistics. It was about human beings, millions of them, whose lives were shattered, whose voices were silenced, whose suffering shaped a nation. To forget them is to betray them. To remember them is to honor them. And so, as I leave this journey, I return to the opening gates, the frozen silence where it began. I hear again the wind across the taiga, the bark of dogs, the creak of wood under frost. But now, I also hear the whispers of survivors, the testimony of writers, the voices of memory. They remind me that the Gulag is not simply past, it is warning. We carry it forward not to dwell on pain, but to defend against its return.